Welcome, everybody. We can get started in 1 minute. I see there's still people rolling in. All right, so let me introduce myself first, and then we'll get into the meat of this, why everybody is here. So I am Rick Southers, known on Instagram as Rick on the Run. I am a photographer and filmmaker focusing on travel and special events all around the world. I'm a Pittsburgh native, born in North Carolina, but raised in Pittsburgh, so this is home. And I've been full-time in my photography career now for going on 7 years. 7 years. So before that, I did some conservation work with youth programming and nonprofits. I'm a pretty outdoorsy guy, so what I'm doing now really aligns with like my passions, and what I found is something that I'm really good at. So let's get into it. So we're here to talk about, photography and learning your camera. If you're in this session, I hope you brought your camera with you. I'm going to be showing you some things on one of my cameras that you can hopefully follow along and learn some things hands-on. I'm a hands-on learner, but I also got some visuals to help you out if you learn better that way. So just some things to start with to keep in mind. If we're going out, I want you to think about going on a trip and you want to capture the best photos you've ever captured, right? So you're planning this trip, you know where you're staying, you got your flights booked, you got all your activities on your itinerary, and now it's time to actually go on this trip, right? Whether you're solo with friends or whatever, there's some things that you should keep in mind before you get started, right? To make sure you capture the best photos possible. So the first thing is expectations, right? If you're traveling with a group, I often travel with a few friends or my girlfriend. And it's good. Well, now everybody knows that I'm there to get the photos, right? So it's not really an issue for me anymore. But if you're traveling with people for the first time or even friends, it's good that everybody understands like your mission, right? If you're there to get photos, videos, content, whatever, make sure that you're all on the same page so you're not rushed through like locations and activities when you're trying to get a shot. It's very important for me to have like just alone time. If there's a shot that I know I want to get, my friends know to walk off, do what they need to do, and let me do my thing, right? Next is shot ideas. I always like to just save inspo that I see on Instagram or Pinterest. If I see cool locations that other people were at, I like to save those just so I know where they're at, and I'll go even look on Google Maps and look through the photos and see if there's any angles that nobody else has used yet that I might be able to take advantage of. And the other thing is just to be considerate, right? Be considerate of the countries you're in, their customs, what their norms are. I'm always very wary. If you do street photography, I'm wary of like photographing women and kids. That's like a sensitive subject for me. So just some things to consider. I see in the chat somebody asked, will I cover GoPro settings? So the settings that I'm going to talk about will apply to any camera that you have. These are universal. So before we get into settings, we are going to talk about gear a little bit, right? So what I shoot with is Nikon mirrorless cameras. This is a Nikon Z6. It's a mirrorless camera. It shoots 4K video, 28 megapixel photos. It's pretty much an all-around powerhouse for photo and videos. And some of the lenses that I usually take with me on trips, This one that's on here now is a 35 millimeter. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. This is a good all-around walk-around lens. It's good for shooting street photography, portraits, group photos, landscapes. It's pretty much a good lens to have for anything. My next favorite lens, this one. Now, this is not a cheap lens. This is not something that a beginner needs to have in their bag. But when you're traveling, this allows me to get a lot of shots that I wouldn't be able to get otherwise, right? Because it zooms into 200 millimeters, which means that, if someone is on the other side of a street, or if I'm on a boat trying to shoot something on land, or on land trying to shoot a photo of someone on a boat or things like that, I'm able to really punch in and get those details. Another one of my favorite travel accessories, I should say. This thing comes with me everywhere. This is the DJI Mini 3 Pro. I just got this drone recently, but it's my favorite now because it's lightweight. It's under the weight limit regulation for most countries. So it's considered a hobbyist drone, even though it's a pro model and it has an amazing camera. So you won't get in trouble for having this because it falls under that weight limit. And it's super light, easy to pack, folds up. It pretty much fits in my pocket. Other important things to have. Please don't go on a trip with not enough memory for all your photos, right? This is important. I always have, well, I have tons of these now because I just collected them over the years, but make sure you always have extra memory cards for your camera. And an important thing to do before any trip is clear those memory cards, right? Make sure they're formatted, empty. You don't have old photos from your birthday on there that you got to delete while you're in the middle of your trip. Make sure you have plenty of memory and it's ready to go in your camera. Next, we want to have extra batteries, right? When you're traveling, you have no idea how long you're going to be out and about for the day. Batteries die fast. They die even faster when it's hot or cold. For people who didn't know that, this is something that you can get on Amazon. Third-party batteries are fine. For me, I haven't had any issues because the original manufacturer batteries tend to be a little bit more expensive. But what I would not cut costs on is the memory cards. Do not cut costs on memory cards. I only shoot with class 10 or above. That makes sure that I don't have any data corruption. It makes sure that my camera doesn't freeze when I'm shooting bursts of photos and things like that. I'm going to pause for a second just to see what you guys are asking me in the chat. Sorry, I missed what the lens was. Okay, cool. So the first lens I mentioned was my 35 millimeter. That's a good walk around lens. It's wide enough to shoot, a whole building, and tight enough that if you walk up, you can get a really clean portrait of somebody. And the second lens that I mentioned was my 70 to 200 millimeter, which is a zoom lens for shooting like really close up details from far away. No problem. All right. So let's move on. I know everybody's here for the settings. Don't worry, we're going to get there. So the lenses that I mentioned, right? 35 falls right in the middle of these first two photos. So the very first photo was shot with a 24 millimeter, which is actually the one that you guys are looking at now, which is why I can't show it to you. But that's a really wide lens, right? You're able to get a lot of your environment and shoot really cool landscapes that way. 50 millimeter is somewhere in the middle, right? So 50 millimeter is, oh, here it is. 50, right? 50 millimeter allows you to kind of capture a subject and a little bit of background, right? It's kind of like a mid-range, really good lens to have. You can get them pretty cheap on Amazon as well. And then that last photo was shot with this big one here, right? And that's when I like to punch in and really get people's faces and emotions and close-ups and things like that. Somebody said, what are you using to hold your camera? Right now, it's on a tripod. I hope that answers your question. Locations. So another thing when I'm going out on trips is scouting locations in advance, right? And one thing that you really want to keep in mind if you want to get the best photos possible is showing up early and staying late. I love to get a lot of my photos during what's called golden hour, which is when the sun kind of falls below the clouds and you get that really nice, even, golden, glowy light. Some of my favorite photos I've ever taken have been during that time. Another thing with locations is try to get in touch with locals when you can, and they'll show you some locations that you didn't even know existed. For example, when I went to Jamaica once, I remember my whole group was going to see Dunn's River Falls, right? That's the big tourist attraction. Everybody wants to walk up and play in the waterfall. And my cab driver told me, you know, don't go there, trust me, and let me take you to Little Dunn's, right? Which is actually where the waterfall carries down closer to the ocean. And there's a waterfall that goes right into the ocean. And it's a little beach and it's only for locals. And that was an amazing experience. So I would say always tap in with the locals. You're going to find way better locations. Show up early, stay late to avoid the crowds. All right. I know this is why everybody's here. So I'm going to make sure I take my time. If I'm going too fast, you guys just put something in the chat. I don't mind going back or repeating myself at all. And I'll make sure I leave time at the end for you guys to ask questions, right? So this is the holy trinity of camera settings, right? ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And in order to properly expose a photo, you have to juggle all three of those things at the same time, right? Which is what seems kind of intimidating for people who are just picking up a camera. So we're going to walk through it, right? And we're going to start on the left with ISO. ISO is what a lot of people like to call artificial light, right? It's a way to make your camera digitally brighten a photo, right? Seems great, right? You just tap your ISO, your photo gets brighter, you're good to go. Except for there's pros and cons to all of these things, right? And there's the other two will be thrown off depending on how you manipulate one. So with your ISO, it is a number that starts at 100. I don't know if you guys can see it. Oh, it might be too bright. Yeah, let me see. See if I can help you guys out. Maybe we can see it. Can you guys see that? Anybody? No? That's too bright. All right, don't worry about it. But if you have your camera in front of you, ISO is a number that's going to start with 100 and it goes all the way up into the thousands, right? So 100 is the lowest setting. That's the setting I always start with, especially if I'm outdoors, because as you increase the ISO, you're going to add grain to your photos because it's artificial light, right? And you know, if you've ever had an iPhone and tried to take a picture in a dark room, how it looks all grainy, that same thing happens even with expensive cameras, depending on how high you crank it up, okay? So if you look on the back of your camera, you'll see something that says ISO, and then you'll see a number next to it. So 100 is the lowest setting. That means you're adding the least amount of artificial light, which means your photo will be the clearest and the cleanest, and you won't be adding any artificial light, which adds grain, right? So 100 is a good starting point. On you know, cloudy days, sometimes I'll crank it up to 250. If I'm indoors, sometimes I'll have to start with 400 and work up from there. But a rule, I typically try to stay under like 1600 ISO, which is pretty manageable for my camera. You won't really notice grain at 1600 on my camera and most modern mirrorless cameras. Maybe my camera, yeah, bring that camera out and dust it off. Okay, so ISO, we got that covered, right? ISO is artificial light on your camera. It should say ISO. How do you adjust the ISO? Good question. So some cameras are touchscreen and you can tap where it says ISO and just crank it up. On other cameras, there'll be a wheel. On my camera, it's this thumb wheel here. I know a lot of Nikon, Sony, and Canon cameras function that same way. So there'll be a button on top that says ISO on my camera. So I'll hold that down and then I'll crank the wheel to change that number. Like I said, most Nikon, Canon, Sony cameras operate the same way. It'll have an ISO button or just a wheel where you crank that and then you'll see that number move. Does anybody have their cameras in front of them? I'm just curious. If you do, tell me what kind of camera you have in the chat. So the next setting we're going to talk about is shutter speed, right? Sony, Canon, Nikon, awesome. Oh, that was my first camera, the Nikon 3300. GoPro, Sony, cool. All right, good to know. Good to know. Yeah, you guys' settings should be in similar places to mine. On GoPro, it's all touchscreen, so you should be able to follow along too. Which is the best? All right, I'm gonna pause to address that question real quick. Which is the best camera, right? The best camera brand. So the legacy brands, right? Canon and Nikon are the big powerhouses. Sony came in the market probably about 5 years ago with their mirrorless cameras and kind of blew everybody out of the water. But now technology has caught up, and to be honest, they're all even. They're really all doing the same thing. They all benchmark each other every year. It's really just a personal preference. I shoot with Nikon because a lot of my favorite photographers from history shoot with Nikon, like Gordon Parks, who's a Black history photographer from Chicago. Teenie Harris shot a lot of Harlem Renaissance era photos of Black people in Pittsburgh. They all shot Nikon. My uncle, who was a Black newspaper photographer, shot Nikon. And if it's up to me, I would say that Nikon colors represent Black skin the best. So that's why I chose Nikon. But like I said, these days, to be fair, they're all even. It's really a personal preference. Sony's autofocus, I would say, is slightly superior if you're shooting video. So I would consider that. All right. Any more questions before I move on into shutter speed? Sony. Yeah, I know y'all like the Sony hype. Okay, cool. So shutter speed, right? I feel like most people, if you spent any time looking at YouTube videos about photography, then you've heard about shutter speed and aperture. So shutter speed is literally how fast your shutter closes to capture a photo. Okay, so this photo that I have in the middle here, the jet ski, right, is a perfect example of needing a high shutter speed. Low shutter speed is okay when you're shooting portraits, people standing still, but as people start to move, even slight movements like changing poses, those photos aren't as sharp because the shutter isn't closing fast enough to capture that motion, right, and really freeze the frame. So I have a couple of examples for you guys that I'll show you after this. So shutter speed is a number that looks like a fraction. I know you guys can't see the screen, but you should see a fraction on your camera. So it's going to say 1/ something else, right? And the smaller that number gets, the slower your shutter is going to close, right? So as you move that number down to 1/50, 1/20, that shutter speed is going to close really slow, so your photos won't be as sharp. But there's a benefit to that. What it's doing is letting in more light at the same time. So sometimes when you're in darker environments, you have to slow down the shutter speed to gather enough light to properly expose that photo. So this is why I said all of these things kind of juggle with each other, because you might increase the shutter speed to get a sharp photo, but now you have to add light back a different way, if that makes sense, right? So your shutter speed on my camera, it's adjusted with that same wheel, the thumb wheel. So if you guys have that, that should move your shutter speed. If not, you're gonna have to go into your menu settings and see which button controls your shutter speed. Like I said, if you have a touch screen, that makes it easy. Most mirrorless cameras these days have touch screens. So I'm going to give you guys some numbers to use. So shutter speed for me, when I'm shooting a still portrait of a person, I try to make sure my shutter speed is 1/125 or higher. That tends to be fast enough to capture somebody who's standing still and posing. Now, if I'm shooting a person that's moving or running or jumping or laughing or talking to people, action shots, then I tend to bump it up to at least 1/250, sometimes 1/500, to make sure that those photos are nice and sharp, right? But like I said, as you start cranking that speed of the shutter up, you're going to get less light coming into your camera. So you have to compensate either with ISO or aperture, which we'll get to next. Now, something like this jet ski photo, I shot that at 1 out of 1,000. So super fast shutter, which means that I had to add a lot of light in different ways. I shot that with this lens actually. So this lens has a pretty wide aperture, and I'll tell you what that means next. And I was able to let in enough light to still have that fast shutter to stop the motion of the jet ski, but still expose the photo properly. So let's move on to aperture, right? Now, aperture is the one thing that is not dependent on your camera, but is dependent on the lens that you use. So for example, this 35mm lens has an aperture of 1.8. And anytime you purchase a lens, or if you look at the lens that you have in front of you, it should tell you somewhere, either on the top or sometimes on the front of the lens, it'll tell you what the lowest aperture is, right? Because that's what makes the lens valuable. The lower the aperture is, the more expensive it typically is, because it's better at capturing and gathering light. And what aperture is, I don't know if you guys can see this, probably not. But what aperture is a bunch of tiny blades, if you look in your lens, and they kind of just like compress and then expand. And that's how it lets light into your camera through the lens, right? So a small aperture number means that it goes really wide and lets a lot of light in. A bigger aperture number like 2.8, or some of you might see 3.5 on your lenses. If you have like the lens that came with the camera, those kit lenses, they usually start at like 3.5 or maybe even a 4 or f/4. And that means that the aperture is not quite as wide. It doesn't let in as much light. So when you're letting in light with a really wide aperture, what you're also doing is creating that nice, creamy background blur, right? That everybody goes for these days, right? The background blur called bokeh that also makes your photos look really professional, right? So if you have an aperture of 1.8 and you're able to bring it all the way down to 1.8, and you can get a nice photo of your subject with the background blurred out. You see how the camera's in focus now and I'm kind of blurred out? That's because this aperture on the camera that I'm using is at a 2.8. So it's not even as wide as it could be. But that's the effect that you get by having a wide aperture. So the wider the aperture, the more light comes in, the more background blur you get, okay? But let's talk about when you would not want a wide aperture. I almost skipped over that. So there's circumstances like when you're shooting landscapes and you want to get a bunch of different things in focus. Like maybe there's a car and then a building and then a mountain behind it, and you want everything to be in focus, but they're all at different distances. That's when you would need a bigger aperture number, right? So you would stop the aperture all the way down to something like f/19 or 20 or 22 even. You can crank up to, so that everything in your scene is in focus. So there's some stylistic choices you have to make with all of these things, but aperture, again, is letting light into your camera and also changing how many things are in focus. Do we have any questions before I move on from this? And I'm going to show you a couple photo examples next. Any questions about ISO, shutter speed, or aperture? Do the same rules apply to video? Great question. Yeah, they do. Aperture, same rules apply if you're shooting a video. Like I'm on video now. I have a wide aperture, so my background is blurred out, right? ISO, same thing. It's just adding artificial light. Same thing works on video. Shutter speed, there's some other considerations with video with shutter speed. Like when you're shooting video and your shutter speed isn't fast enough, sometimes you'll see lights flickering. Because the shutter is closing at a different speed than like the light bulbs flicker in your house, if that makes sense. Like we all know lights aren't constant, they're just really fast and our eyes can't capture it, but cameras can. So shutter speed, the rule is usually that you shoot double the shutter speed of your frame rate, and frame rate is video specific. We'll have to talk about that another time. But yeah, most of the rules apply across the board. I hope that helps. I need to get pics of a kid that moves nonstop. Well, the fast shutter setting makes sense. Absolutely, that's what you need. Yeah, you got a kid that's running around and jumping around. I would shoot at least 1 out of 250, maybe even 1 out of 500 if you can. But like I said, that's going to make the photo darker because you're closing the shutter so fast and light isn't getting in. So you have to compensate with ISO or aperture if you have a lens that can achieve a wide aperture. All right. So these are some examples of using aperture to create that background blur, right? So this first one on the left was shot at an f2.8 aperture. So you can see the subject is in focus and the background is kind of blurred out, but not like out. The second one, that was shot at 1.8. And I actually focused on the boat. So you can see that that's my girlfriend, Taylor, by the way. You can see that she's kind of blurred out. And my focus was the boat so that you could kind of like see what she was looking at. That's what I was trying to achieve with that photo. And that third one was shot at an aperture of 1.8, really wide aperture. Those trees in the back are like super blurry. Even some of the pool behind her is kind of blurry, but she's really sharp, and the basket is really sharp, if that makes sense. So that's just a little aperture demonstration. This is a shutter speed demonstration, okay? So I actually put these in order. So this very first photo, it's a kid. I went on a trip with a group of kids studying abroad in Spain, some kids from New York. And this was the first time surfing. So I got to capture that. Super dope. But he was walking out of the water with his surfboard. You know, there's waves crashing. He's moving. He's throwing up whatever that is in Brooklyn. I don't know. I'm not going to insinuate. But that's 1 out of 250 shutter speed, right? So that captured him walking, waves splashing, but it was still sharp enough because he wasn't moving that fast, right? He's just walking. The second one, that's Taylor again. She's diving off of the yacht. We were in Greece this summer, and I had to shoot that at 1 out of 750, really fast, right? In order to freeze her in the air. Good form, by the way. And that last one we talked about earlier, the jet ski, I shot that at well over 1,000 shutter speed in order to freeze that jet ski coming across the water. Good form, right? Can I repeat the numbers? Yeah, sure. So the first photo, the kid walking out of the ocean with the surfboard, that was 1 out of 250 shutter speed. Second photo of Taylor diving off the boat, that was 1 out of 750 shutter speed. So that's a lot faster. You're gonna make sure you're gonna have to make sure you have enough light, either with aperture or adding ISO, which is always a last resort for me, is adding ISO. So that middle one, 1 out of 750. And then that last one was it's either 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 1,250, but it's well over 1,000 for sure in order to freeze that jet ski because she was moving. We got that? Cool, cool, cool. All right. Moving on. What questions do we have? We got plenty of time left. Anybody have any questions? Anything I didn't cover? Lighting, please. Sure. So lighting, like I said, you can add lighting with your ISO artificially. Aperture, having a wide aperture also lights your photos better because that lens opens up and lets more light into the camera. What do all the symbols on the camera mean? On the flywheel? Good question. So every camera's flywheel is a little bit different, but some of the things that are the same, you'll have like an auto mode. You'll have something that probably has an M for manual, and there's aperture priority, which is, I've seen it represented different on different cameras. It could be an A, it could be an AP. And aperture priority is where you set the aperture and then all the other settings kind of go on auto and shoot for you. So I always shoot a manual. I haven't taken my camera off of manual in years. There's certain situations where auto and aperture priority makes sense, but manual just gives you the most control over your settings, especially when you're in different environments like traveling where you don't know if you're going to be indoors, outdoors, moving around. I just like to keep it on manual because I can hit all my settings. When it's in auto, you don't have the control over your settings. So say you have your camera on auto and it's not doing what you needed to do, you're not going to be able to adjust your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture in the moment to compensate for your camera not really gathering the information the way that it needs to. It's a computer and it's not perfect, right? Cameras are amazing these days, but they're not perfect. So I never really trust auto to do anything that I wanted to do because, photography is very much a subjective art. So there's different situations where I might want a slow shutter speed to get some motion blur, or I might want a really wide aperture to get, a portrait with a blurry background. And my auto setting is just not going to know that. So I always keep it in manual. All right. Please repeat the aperture numbers. Sure. So let's go back to aperture. So these apertures were all pretty low, which is kind of my style. I tend to shoot with a wide aperture as much as possible because I really like the background blur, right? So the one on the left was an f2.8, right? The one in the middle was 2.2, and the photo on the right was 1.8. Got that? Danielle, I hope that answered your question with the flywheel. Linda asked, start additional lighting and when to use flash. Okay, cool. Wow. So flash photography is something that for me is exclusive to like nighttime and indoor situations, right? I would never use flash outside. It's just unnecessary. It can be harsh if you don't know how to control it. And it's just not a look that I personally care for. I use flash when I'm shooting like weddings and things like that. It's good for filling shadows in dark rooms. So that would be my answer with flash. Pro cameras do not come with like a pop-up flash built in. So that's another reason that I don't really use flash often, is because I have to actually add a flash on top of my camera in order to do that. So I hope that helps, Linda. Indoors, at night, those are really the only situations where I would use flash. How do you remember anything? Any fun acronyms like righty tighty? Oh, that's a good question. I don't have any fun acronyms. Oh man, I wish I came up with one. I'm gonna have to work on that for next time. Any more questions? We got questions about cameras, gear, memory cards. What else do we talk about? Batteries, lenses. I feel like lenses is the most important purchase most of you guys are gonna make. What do you use to house all your photos? Google runs out. Yes, it does. I don't use Google at all. Hate it. Good question. So I use solid state drives to house all my photos, and I have a bunch of them. Right? They're small, they're fast. I keep them with me. If I'm like editing on the go, they plug right into my laptop. The good thing about a solid state drive, especially for travel, is that it's not a hard drive. Hard drives have a little disk that spins in it. Solid state drives don't have any moving parts, right? So they're more durable. You don't have to worry about them like getting bumped around in your backpack and then losing all your photos. So as soon as I get to a hotel or wherever I'm at, I dump all my photos from my memory card in my camera to a solid state drive every day if I can. Doesn't happen every day. Sometimes I'm tired and I just go to sleep, but as often as possible, I back up my photos on a solid state drive. Great question. All right, let's see what else we. All right. Alicia said, what are some tips that you have for new photographers? I would say learn your camera before you start buying new gear. I would say early on for me, I've always been like a tech junkie. I like gadgets and gear and electronics, and I buy all kind of stuff I don't need. But I would say that you're going to improve the fastest by really learning what you already have, even if that's just an iPhone. What is your backup if that one breaks? So if I've never had a solid state drive break or corrupt, but I do have things for clients backed up on Dropbox as well. So I have solid state drive, which is physical, and I have digital backups on Dropbox. But that's just for clients. All of my travel stuff is on those solid state drives, and I haven't had any issues since I moved to solid state drives. I've had hard drives corrupt years ago, which is why I don't use those anymore. Let's see. Do I use a gimbal? Yes, I do. I use the DJI RS2. I use that for video when there's going to be a lot of motion, like if I'm hiking or running and chasing somebody playing sports and things like that. My cameras have in-body stabilization, so I'm able to shoot a lot of things handheld without a gimbal, and they still look pretty smooth. Or I'm at a point where I know how to stabilize things in post-editing as well. But I do own a gimbal. It does come in handy. It is very heavy, and I hate carrying it around when I don't have to. All right. Diva said, I joined late, so I may have missed this. What are your must-pack photography items? Good question. So I'll run back through some of the things that I mentioned at the beginning. So I pack with me when I go on a trip tons of memory cards, right? That's one. Tons of extra batteries, right? My lenses, 35 is always with me. 70 to 200 is always with me. And the one that I'm using right now is my 24 to 70, and that's like a mid-range zoom that's usually on my camera all the time. My drone is a must pack. I didn't mention these earlier, but we can. Camera strap, must pack on trips. This is a Peak Design camera strap, which has like this little quick release, so I can snap it on and off the camera. Because I don't actually like shooting with a strap on my camera. It kind of gets in the way of my hands when I'm trying to move through my settings quickly. So I carry it with the strap, but I usually take it off when I'm actually shooting. And this one we didn't mention earlier, but we can. Another accessory is an ND filter. I use these as kind of just like sunglasses for your camera lens. So if your photo is like too bright, but you have the settings where you want, you can slap one of these on and kind of bring it back in so you're not getting like washed out colors. All right, let's see. Do you have any iPhone tips? Yep, sure. So this rule applies to iPhones and cameras, but always shoot underexposed versus overexposed, right? Especially if you're shooting raw photos, it's way easier to bring back information from a dark photo than it is from a photo that's too bright or overexposed, right? We've all seen those photos where they're like washed out and white. You can try to edit it as much as you want. It's never going to be right. But if you shoot a little bit underexposed, just a little bit darker, you can always raise it up when you're editing it and save those photos. So that would be my tip for iPhones as well as cameras. On the iPhone specifically, I like to use that little, you know, when you tap and hold for your exposure and adjust it, that is my favorite tool on the iPhone. Because if you hold it down, the exposure locks. And then when you slide it down, it won't change on you when you're looking at different things. So I always bring it down so that it's not quite as bright as iPhone likes it to be. Let's get that solid state drive affiliate link. Okay, send me a DM and I'll send you the link from Amazon. I got you. Thoughts on GoPro? Do you use it in addition to a camera? Yeah, I have a couple of GoPros laying around. I take them with me everywhere, but I typically only use them if I'm gonna be underwater. GoPro was actually the first camera I ever owned, so I love GoPro. I still buy the new ones, but I typically only use them these days when I'm underwater or if I'm doing something like action related where I'll like strap it on my head or on my chest just to get a different point of view. I need to purchase a solid state drive. Yes, you do. Lost your data from hard drives a couple of days ago. Ooh, it's terrible. Osmo Pocket. Yeah, I have an Osmo Pocket. It's a cool little camera. It's really powerful. Osmo is a great camera. It's stabilized. It's tiny. And you can attach your phone to it to use it as like a monitor. Love the Peak Design straps. What kind of drone do you have? So this is the Mini 3 Pro. I purchased the Mini 3 Pro actually because I got in trouble for flying my bigger drone in Spain this summer over a castle where I was not supposed to be flying apparently. And I bought this drone because it falls under the weight limit. It's considered a hobbyist drone, but it also has a new feature where the camera will rotate sideways so you can shoot portrait mode for like reels, which is really, really cool. I don't have to like crop my wide videos anymore. I can just flip the camera with a button and shoot those tall photos or videos. You said 35 millimeters, 70 to 200. And the last one is a 24 to 70. So that's like my mid-range zoom lens. So it shoots really wide, and then 70 is also really good to punch in on portraits. Shooting in British winter with 2 seconds of sunlight a day is a challenge. I get that. I live in Pittsburgh, so it's one of the cloudiest cities in the country. So one thing to consider when you're shooting in really dark and cloudy places is getting a lens with a wide aperture for sure. So I would invest in something with the aperture of at least 1.8 so that you can shoot in kind of those low light situations or even indoors without having to add too much ISO, which will end up with grainy photos. When going on trips, do you plan out the aesthetic you're looking for prior to the trip, or do you go with the flow? So I do plan some shots, but a lot of my best shots just happen spontaneously, to be honest. Like one of my favorite photos I took this year that's on my Instagram page was like a sunset over the ocean, and I was actually just chilling having a beer, and I saw this boat like passing through the sunset, and I like grabbed my camera and ran out and shot it. So that was not planned at all. But most places kind of have their own aesthetic, so I kind of like to go off of what that is. Like, you know, if you're in Europe, you know, there's going to be like old architecture and street markets and things like that. If I'm in Bali, then I know it's going to be really green or really blue because there's jungle and ocean, right? So I kind of go with the vibe or whatever the aesthetic of the place is. To use a shot list, yeah. In my notes, I make a list of some shots that I want to make sure I want to get based on the itinerary that I have for that trip. Cool, cool, cool. What else y'all got for me? These are great questions. What's your process when creating videos? Ooh, okay. All right, we got some time, so why not talk about videos? All right, we're gonna go back into settings for videos then. Let's do it since we got 15 minutes. Yeah, we can do it. So everybody pick your cameras back up and switch to video mode. So even on an iPhone or a camera, the first thing that you want to adjust when you're gonna shoot a video is your frame rate, right? So on your iPhone in the top right, you'll see something that says either 24 frames per second, 30, 60. I think iPhones even do 120 now. And it's the same, oh, Android, sorry. I used to have an Android in the 90s or something, I don't know. So iPhone, top right corner, you're gonna see frames per second or FPS, 24, 30, 60, or 120, right? On your camera, it's gonna be the same thing. So this camera goes up to 120 frames per second. So let's break down what that means. Frames per second is literally how many frames or photos that your camera is capturing with every second of video, right? So 24 frames per second means that every 1 second of video is made up of 24 photos, essentially. And 24 frames per second is the standard for film. 90% of the movies you watch are shot in 24 frames per second in Hollywood. And that's that look and feel that is really cinematic, right? So moving up to like 60 frames per second is something I would only do if I were shooting something that I know I wanted to slow down later, right? Because 24 frames is always going to be the basis for my edits and like my final product. They're always going to come out in 24 frames. So I'll shoot things in higher frame rates when I know I want to slow them down later, so that match that 24 frames per second. So let me give you an example. So if I shoot an interview of a person, right, I'll shoot that in 24 frames per second because it's real time. I want them speaking in real time, moving in real time. But then if I get some B-roll, say of like whatever's in the background, B-roll of a waterfall or people walking down the street, I'll change my frame rate to 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second so that I can slow that down later. So if it's 60 frames per second, I'll slow it down 40 to 40%, and that'll make it match my 24 frames per second timeline. Did y'all grab that? I hope so. All right. No. All right, I'm gonna do it one more time. 24 frames per second is the standard for Hollywood and any other type of film. 24 frames per second is what you should be shooting if you're shooting anything that is meant to be real time, if you want it to look natural. Now, 24 frames per second, you cannot slow that down or else it will look choppy because there aren't enough photo frames within that information. Does that make sense? So if you want something that you're gonna put in slow-mo later, you have to raise the frame rate to at least 60 frames per second so that there's more information in there that when you slow it down, it's still smooth. Got it? Okay. 120 frames per second for the B-roll is my go-to. Yeah, that's awesome. If you can do 120 frames, if you got a camera that does it, that's dope. I also have 120 frames on my cameras. You get some really, really buttery smooth B-roll for sure. So the next thing to consider when you're shooting video with a camera is that your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. And that prevents your videos from being jittery and choppy, right? So your shutter speed, if your frame rate, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be at least 1 out of 50. 24 frames per second, 1 out of 50 shutter speed. Got it? If you're shooting B-roll at 60 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be at least 125. Most cameras don't do 120, which would be exactly double. So 125 is the closest. All right. So frames per second or frame rate. Shutter speed is next. And then the rules of ISO and aperture apply the same way they do in photography. So ISO, keep it low, especially in video, because when you add grain to a video, that's when it's moving, like the snow on the TV. You know what I'm talking about? Like low quality old TV pictures where you get that snow. That's what it's going to look like if you add too much ISO to a video. And aperture works the same way it does in photos. It decides what's in focus, how much of your image is in focus, how blurry the background is, and also how much light is coming in. Got that? Can you repeat the frame rate and shutter speed? Yep, no problem. We'll do it one more time. Frame rate is how many photos are contained in each second of video, right? Every second of video has a certain amount of photo frames within it. So 24 frames per second is the standard. That's going to be the frame rate that you use for anything that should be real time, people talking, interviews, etc. And that should also be the standard for your finished product if you're doing editing. Now for B-roll, 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second is better because you get more frames within each second of video. Therefore, when you slow it down, it still looks smooth instead of looking like a photo slideshow because there aren't enough frames there. Got that? And then your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So whatever frame rate you choose, 24 frames for real time, 60 frames for B-roll, your shutter speed should be double whatever that number is. All right, got it. Cool. Did I answer everybody? Yeah. Okay, good. Do you sell your B-roll? Ooh. So I just started using a Wirestock. Wirestock is a stock video and photography website that actually puts your photos and videos out to all the other stock sites, right? Because the reason I was so hesitant to get into like selling stock photography, and I still haven't done much to be honest. I need somebody to like upload it for me. So I need a virtual assistant. So holla at me. But I like Wirestock because they send it out to all the other stock sites on your behalf, and they just take a little commission. So yeah, stock stuff is something that I just started doing. I've sold like raw footage and licensed it to clients in the past. Like, you know, I'll give them their final deliverable, whatever it is, like a YouTube video or whatever. And then sometimes they'll want the raw video to license it just for future use on their end. And I've done that as well. How do you make money with the content you have left over? I hope that answered it. Yeah. License the raws on the back end. How's the pricing and what's the licensing agreement with Wirestock? So you retain all copyright privileges for your photos and videos on Wirestock. All the content still belongs to the photographer, which I like. I never like to give up ownership. The numbers I don't know off the top of my head. Like I said, I don't use it that often. Yeah. We can talk about that. Yeah, because what's needed right now that I actually hear from a lot of travel companies is images of Black travelers. There is a huge demand for images of Black travelers. So get your solid state drives and organize your archives of travel photos, because I do get hit up pretty often for photos of Black travelers. But yeah, they don't be trying to pay what they're supposed to pay. You know, these are premium photos. They're rare, exclusive. Send us affiliate link for solid state drive. Okay, I got you. Send me a DM and I'll send you a link. I'll make a little Amazon list after this. Post email. Perfect. Well, you can DM me at Rick_on_the_run on Instagram, but BTA is going to send it out in the email. So we got you covered. That's it. Cool. What program do you use for editing photos? I use Lightroom. Do you think travelers need a camera? To be honest, nah, you don't need it. You can definitely get by on an iPhone. Use what you have. Learn what you have. iPhone has a lot of capabilities. You can even add like lenses and things to it to get different looks. So yeah, like I told somebody else earlier, learn and use what you have to its fullest potential before you consider investing in gear, because it's an expensive habit. I use Final Cut for video. Final Cut's great. The good thing about Final Cut is that you only have to pay for it once. All of my work exists in the Adobe ecosystem. So I use Premiere Pro for video editing, just because it works so easily with After Effects and Photoshop and Lightroom. They all kind of talk to each other in the cloud. But yeah, that's my go-to. Any pro tips for Final Cut video editing? I haven't used Final Cut in years, but pro tips for video editing in general is being organized makes everything easier. So having a solid state drive with all of your footage archived by dates and locations, and then being able to drag those folders into whatever your video editing software is going to make the process a lot more enjoyable and a lot easier. My process is kind of to find all of the clips that I know I want to include in an edit, put those in a separate folder, organize them on a timeline, and then kind of trim them down to really just kind of get like a rough idea of the story. And then I add things like B-roll and graphics, and then I'll go into sound design and add music and sound effects next. I need to learn my GoPro before I get into thinking about an actual camera. Yeah, definitely. You can do a lot with a GoPro. The good thing about it is all the settings are touchscreen. So if you turn on ProTune on a GoPro, and you can go through your shutter speed and ISO and all of that good stuff. GoPros, last time I checked, have a set aperture, so you can't change the aperture of your photos, but you can play with like shutter speed to get like more or less motion blur and things like that. What drone do you use? Mavic Mini 3 Pro. Yeah, same one. I'm here. I'm gonna get out these last 4 minutes. Bring on the questions. I use Artlist for music. Which music likes my music? Cool. I heard good things about Artlist. I use Epidemic Sound. They got a lot of dope playlists, like curated, and it also kind of like tracks like the songs that I use, and it'll like make suggestions to me for similar songs, which I like. But yeah, I've heard Artlist has a pretty big music library too. Yep. Do I have a YouTube channel? Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I don't use it, but it's there. Yeah, go subscribe. I'm gonna start posting some videos. It's Rick on the Run on YouTube as well. And YouTube actually just launched a feature where like they have tags, so it's easier to search people now. So if you search it just like you would on Instagram, it should come up. Travis used Epidemic Sound too. Dope. Yeah, I spend hours on Epidemic Sound just like saving songs that I'm gonna use in the future. How do you make sure you don't get in trouble with licensing your music? So I Epidemic Sound is all copyright free music. That's why I use it for all of my client projects. If I need like a popular song, I just go through like the Instagram Reels function and use their music library. But yeah, everything on Epidemic Sound is copyright free, so you shouldn't get in any trouble. But if you're on YouTube, you also should put it in your caption, like what the song is, who created it. You're welcome. What's been your most successful campaign? Ooh, okay. Let me think. Let me think. All right, I can give you like the most enjoyable and then the most profitable, maybe. Is that what you're asking? Oh man, let me think. What's been my favorite? Favorite campaign. Okay. I think I know. My favorite campaign has, I gotta give you a few, actually. And they were all this year. It just gets better every year. All right. So this summer I went to Spain with a company that does study abroad experiences for kids to learn Spanish. It was a bunch of kids from New York. Um, for a lot of them, it was their first time overseas. Most of them, I think, a lot of them it was their first passport stamp, and yeah, Toca. And I got to document the whole thing. Right, it was super dope. Great group of kids. We were in Sevilla, Spain, for almost a month, for like 3.5 weeks. Um, it was a really like intimate experience. The kids lived with a local family and they walked to school every day. And they did a lot of cool activities. So they learned how to make paella. They had a flamenco dancing class. We went to Cadiz on the weekend and they learned to surf. What else did they do? They went to a bullfight. I missed the bullfight. I had to leave early. What else? And yeah, they got to interact with other kids at the school. They were in there exchanging Cardi B lyrics with Spanish songs. It was a dope experience. So that was really cool to see. Next favorite would have to be, I did a shoot for a yacht company in Greece this summer. It actually fell on my girlfriend Taylor's birthday, so I took her along. It was kind of like a birthday trip, and we just had like the best private yacht sailing experience ever. Went to all these islands in Greece that I'd never heard of, and they paid me to create reels and photos daily. So I would wake up on the yacht. We had a hostess that would make breakfast for us. We'd pull up to an island, walk around the town, get lunch, and I would photograph the places we went, photograph the experience on the boat. Made reels of us swimming in these beautiful crystal clear waters, and a lot of drone shots from that trip, of the boat just sailing around. And yeah, that was probably one of my favorites for sure. And let me think. What else? Okay, I got one more for y'all. One more favorite was a group travel company, T World Tours, that I was with in Bali for almost a month because she had two groups come. There was a little bit of time in between, but the cool thing about this trip was that it was super luxury, super intimate. I mean, like 6 people, right? Not one of those group trips with like 50 people where you're forced to stay up all night and party. Those are cool too, but I'm getting too old for it. So it was like 6 people in the group, super luxury. They're just like eating breakfast in the pool and spa days. Went on a little waterfall hike. But one of the cool things for me capturing the trip was that there was this one girl on the trip who, actually, I'm gonna pull her photo back up for y'all just because I have it. This one. This is Esme, and this day she took her first hike ever, which ended with her seeing her first waterfall ever after she was on her first plane ride ever to her first foreign country ever. And it was just like crazy day, crazy day. All my shots that day were Esme, but I just realized we're over time. So that's all I got for y'all. I hope y'all learned something. Holla at me on Instagram. I'll get all those affiliate links and everything out, in the BTA email that follows up. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Feel free to ask me questions. I have a pretty strong record of replying to 100% of my DMs. I try to be pretty accessible. So holla at me if y'all need something. If not, I'll get those links to y'all in the BTA email. Cool, cool, cool. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, I'm out. Peace.